Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate the recent support on all of our recent content. So today we're going to be discussing, the X factors in the East. This is a direct continuation of our previous episode. And before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so, we're pretty much, going over to the Eastern Conference, right? A little bit different than the West, right? Obviously, there are some really good teams in the East, but as you go down, it's a little bit different. But, like last time, we're going to start at the top, work our way down. We'll start with the Celtics. And I would say Porzingis is pretty much their main X factor. Obviously, that's the, biggest acquisition they made outside of the holiday trade. And he's been really good for them this year, right? Obviously you look at their team, right? One in offense, second in defensive rating. He's a big part of that, right? When you look at what he's able to do on both ends of the floor, he's averaging 20 a game, 7 rebounds, 2 assists, 52 from the field, 38 from 3, 2 blocks a game. And the 52 from the field is a career high by a pretty decent amount. I think his previous career high was last year, just under 50%. And part of that is because, we talked about in the offseason where now he's become a much more effective post player, right? So now he can take advantage of, mismatches. Whereas before, right, he was a lot less comfortable doing that. He didn't do it in Dallas. And that was kind of a problem, right? Where that was how the Clippers beat the Mavs. That was one of the ways where they kind of made him on offense not really as playable, right? They would play really small and kind of, dare him to kind of beat them from the inside, and he couldn't. But now he can. Um, obviously he's played in 46 games this year, right? Their record, is 52 and 14, right? So he's missed about 20-ish games or so. Which, you kind of expect. You didn't really expect him to probably play like, 75 games or whatever. The main thing is that he's been out for a little bit. I mean, you assume that like they don't really need him to win a ton of regular season games at this point. They wrapped up the 1 seed, so
Yeah.
obviously they're just trying to make sure he's healthy. Um, right? They've been shooting great from three this year as a team, right? They've essentially been number one in the league in 3-point percentage. I think it's dropped a little bit as of late, right? But I mean, either way, like it's still a crazy percentage. They're towards the top of the league in attempts, right? Obviously, the thing is they don't go to the line a ton, right? Because they're, more of a perimeter oriented team. And we've seen that can kind of be a problem for them in the playoffs, right? Like
Yeah.
last year, right? They weren't really comfortable going to the basket. They couldn't really attack Miami's zone defense. Porzingis makes their offensive attack a lot more diverse while also still allowing them to be really good defensively.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tatum, right? He's had a really good season, right? He's even though he's been putting up really good numbers, he's typically not really considered part of the MVP discussion. Jalen Brown's been playing some of his best basketball, especially from an efficiency standpoint, right?
Yeah.
23 a game is down, right? But the efficiency is up. Threes are still fine. Right. And he's taking advantage of the fact that now, he doesn't have quite as much defensive attention placed on him because you got to put somebody on Holiday. You got to put somebody on Porzingis. So I mean, they have the 1 seed locked up. So really the main thing for them, is can you still get a healthy and impactful Porzingis? And then, if you get out of the East and you play maybe the Nuggets, can you be able to close them out in crunch time? Because, that was the issue for them in those last couple of regular season matchups against them, where they did fine for most of the game, right? But then when it came crunch time, they just couldn't figure it out. And I think they could probably still do it against most teams, but obviously their goal is to try to win a championship. So if they can figure that part out, then they have a really good shot. But either way, it's still going to be tougher, I think, come playoff time because we know, right? 3-point percentages usually are lower. Defense is a lot different and more focused in. And then obviously Tatum, right? Can he, kind of step up and be, basically a top 3-5 guy in the postseason, right? When we know he's already like one of the best players in the NBA, but can he basically be the best player on the floor in pretty much every series? And if that's the case, that's where they got also, a better shot at winning.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with pretty much everything you said. In regards to Porzingis, he's definitely one of their X factors. I think he's a mismatch nightmare. On offense and defense. He's very lengthy. He can block a lot of shots. He's great at defense, and he can also shoot himself. So he's got a lot going for him. And I think The move that they made to get him has worked out beautifully in the regular season. Like you said, it's just a matter of what is his impact going to be in the postseason, and is he really going to be a factor against certain teams like Denver? Say they do get to the finals, and it's a Denver versus Boston, matchup. I mean, what would that look like for Porzingis? Would he get bullied, or would he be able to create and wreak some havoc
Right.
for or on Jokic and things like that? So that's something I think to monitor. But another X factor I think is definitely Drew Holiday. That's another one of their acquisitions. Um, and it's interesting because I think he does bring a lot of defensive tenacity. Obviously, it's a direct upgrade from Marcus Smart. I believe. I think he's a smarter offensive player than Marcus Smart was or is.
No pun
But
intended.
yeah, yeah, no pun intended. But regardless, his numbers, they don't look amazing, but he's never really been a stat sheet kind of guy. You kind of just see him, and he just breathes and reeks defensive prowess, and that's that's what he is. He's a really good perimeter defender, if not one of the best. And I think that goes a long way, because say we do get the Boston Denver matchup, I think he's one of the guys that could potentially help slow down and trap Jamal Murray, and I think he might be probably one of the only people in the league that could potentially do that and bait him into turning the ball over a decent chunk of times alongside the rest of the Boston Celtics. Because, I mean, you've even got guys like Derek White, too. So it's something to watch, and I think that's a huge factor as well. So I would go with Porzingis and Drew Holiday.
Yeah, and then even with Porzingis defensively, right? Let's say against a team like Milwaukee or any
Hmm.
team that has like a high volume pick and roll guard, right, where
Yeah.
he's gonna have to be out on the perimeter, and get switched out, right? So then that means somebody else is gonna have to try to guard, the interior,
Hmm.
in terms of help defense. So, can their other bigs also be impactful as well, right? So can Horford and Porzingis, maybe get some shine together, or even a guy like Xavier Tillman or Luke Cornett or one of those other guys.
Yeah.
Like because that there's going to be some matchups where they may have to play with some additional size out there, that can also switch. So that's just something to think about. And like you said, they're big acquisitions. It kind of makes sense that those guys are X factors because they were brought in to help deliver a championship to Boston. So if those guys continue to play well, like they've been doing all season, because like you said, Holiday, his raw numbers seem like they're down, and obviously he's an older guy, so you kind of expect it. But also unlike in Milwaukee, right? He's not. You're not asking him to do as much on the offensive end, anyways, right?
Yeah.
Like in Milwaukee, he was basically their third guy for the most part, and their point guard, really for the most part, right? But in Boston, he's sharing, point guard duties with Derek White, right? In addition to Tatum and Brown also handling the ball a
Yeah, for
decent
sure.
amount. So, his main thing is kind of like more of a 3 and D guy now, right? And he's been shooting, well over 40% from three, 44%, which is pretty much, a career high, right? I think his previous high was a couple seasons ago. Um, in Milwaukee, I think he shot 41%, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the thing, is that like he's had a pretty good season, from that standpoint in terms of shooting, right? This is his lowest in terms of his raw numbers since his rookie year, but the impact and the efficiency is there on both ends of the floor. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? The two guys you brought in gave up a decent amount for. They need to be a factor in the postseason. Holiday's already been on championship, contending teams,
Hmm.
won a championship with the
Hmm.
Bucks. So there'd be no reason to kind of question that whether or not he could do it again.
Right.
And then with Porzingis, as long as he's healthy, I think he'll probably be fine, because I think he's been really impactful this year. And I think the fact that again he's not just a 3 point shooter anymore, that's going to help them.
Yeah.
And then next up, we move on, to the next group, or the next seed in the East. Right, there's kind of gone back and forth, but I think we'll start with them just because it's a little more interesting. I think is the Bucks. Right, so I guess as of now they're kind of going back and forth between the Cavs for that 2-3 seed.
Yeah.
I think you kind of assume the Bucks will probably pick it up, but either way, when you look at their, setup, I think, for them, the X factor, I guess, would kind of be Chris Middleton in a way, right? He just came back, as we're recording, right? He came back earlier today against the Suns. That was his first game back, looked pretty solid, from an offensive standpoint, right? He had been out for a while. And that's kind of nice, because again, there had been a long stretch, right, since Doc came in. There was a long stretch where Middleton wasn't really playing.
Yeah.
He's played in 43 games this season, so he's missed like, 20 whatever games. But he's been battling injuries pretty much the last 3 seasons. So, that's something where like if he can be healthy and impactful, I think that can kind of sneakily make the Bucks better than we think they might be. mainly just because, that's an additional guy that can help you on the offensive end. So it's not basically just Lillard and Giannis. Um, that's the third guy, right? Where he's got, he no longer has like the other team's best defender,
Yeah.
on him. So now he can kind of take advantage of some matchups. You would hope that that would kind of free some of the other guys up defensively, and allow them to slide into their roles. Obviously defense is an X factor for them too, because, like their defense has been better with Doc, but I still think there's going to be some issues come playoff time anyways, because you just still don't have like great defensive personnel. Obviously you still have, Giannis and Lopez on the interior. There's going to be some teams where I think it may be a little tougher for Brook. Especially now that they don't really have any more point of attack guys other than I guess Beverly, who doesn't really start. Um, but I think for Middleton, if he's healthy, I think they might be, at least offensively, even a little bit better. Because when Doc first came over, the offense kind of sputtered, even though the defense was good. But now I think it's going to be closer to being back to normal. Obviously, again, it's still going to be interesting to see how they match up against Boston, since Boston has the guards and the wings that Milwaukee doesn't really have. But Milwaukee does have Giannis, which no one else really has. And if he and Lillard can kind of figure out, the pick and roll together, right? Lillard had a pretty good game today against the Suns. And they've been one of the better teams in crunch time on both ends of the floor. Which is kind of interesting, right? Because their defense has been so up and down, but late in games, it's been pretty solid. So if it gets close, right, they have a good chance of pulling it out. Since they have two really solid go-to offensive guys. Even Middleton is a guy you can sometimes go to late in games. So I think if he's healthy, right, I think they still have a real shot. But if he's, just physically just kind of can't really do much, then I think they're probably not going to really be able to do it because I think you need all three of those guys healthy because those are your three best players and they're all, star level guys. So, not having one of them, I think, is going to make it tough. So I think that's the biggest one for them.
Yeah. I would definitely say it's defense. It can take them a long way. Like if they figure out the defense completely and fully, and figure out the game plan, I think,
Right.
they could potentially go to the finals. Just like they
They've
have
been
just a
better.
yeah, they have just as good of a shot as like, say the Boston Celtics. I think if they do figure out the defense, it's just how realistic is that going to be when your perimeter guys are Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley, and that's something that we've kind of talked about throughout the majority of this season. But it is kind of impressive to see their defense get better. Like you said, I think like since Doc took over, they have been a top 10 defense in the NBA, alongside being, I believe, let me see here, a top 5 offense in the league too. So, there's a lot of potential here. And I think that's kind of the story of the Bucks right now, because Damian Lillard, I think he's also low-key an X factor. I know that's kind of wild to say, but I think it's more so of his talent. Like if he just shows out and goes full on Dame time mode, like hey, they might have a chance, because that was the whole point of bringing him here in the first place, where you need some explosive help. You need more help than just Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton, and I think Damian Lillard is clearly the upgrade that they needed offensively. It's just they took a massive hit defensively, and that's kind of what we expected. But yeah, for them to be in a dogfight with the Cavs is not a good thing, I don't think, at this point in the season, because I think they would probably prefer to be the second seed in the East right now, given the standings and things like that. But regardless, I think it is very impressive considering, like I said, who their perimeter talent is defensively, that they have been somewhat on the up and up and in the middle of the pack defensively. But in the playoffs, if they turn up that intensity and really, really figure it out, hey, that's the X factor for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and then moving on, the Cavs, right? They're the next one, right? They're
Yeah.
third in the Eastern Conference, but again, it's been pretty back and forth. Pretty remarkable considering the fact that they've had, a number of their key guys miss a lot of time, right? Like Darius Garland's only played in 43 games. So, essentially he's missed, like well over 20 games. I think they played
Yeah.
in 67, right? So he's missed over 20, he's missed almost 25 games, right?
Hmm.
Donovan Mitchell has missed like 15 plus games, almost 20. Um, Evan Mobley's obviously missed a lot of time, right? Like 30-ish games. But again, interestingly enough, right, they've gotten a great year out of Jared Allen. He's been pretty much everything you could have asked for, right? Averaging over a block a game, 16 points, 11 rebounds. I would say their X factor really is still going to be, I think, the two bigs because the main thing with them is last year in the playoffs it didn't work really on either end of the floor, right? Because offensively it was clogged up because neither guy, can really space the floor. And then even defensively, they were getting out rebounded getting out physical, which was a problem. I
Right.
think the hope for the Cavs, which I guess you could also, if you don't say the X factor is the two bigs, you could just say the young guys in general, right? Where it's like now they know what a playoff series is like, so you're kind of hoping that they can kind of take what they saw happen to them last year and kind of build on it, right? So guys like Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, right, Jared Allen, that was kind of their first big, postseason, stint.
Yeah.
So you're kind of hoping maybe that you might get, a better look from them this time around. And they do have more perimeter shooting, which helps, right? Because last year they were, you know, pretty much a very bad 3-point shooting team for the most part. I think they're about league average, right? 16th in 3-point percentage, which
Hmm.
is better than last year. So
Yeah.
I mean, um, and I think like because they've had some guys out, it's a little bit skewed. And the rotations changed somewhat, right? Because a guy like a Sam Merrill wasn't playing earlier in the year, right? But now he's playing more. He's been shooting the ball really well. Guys like Craig Porter Jr., right, wasn't really playing at all. Then he started to play. Georges Niang, right, Max Strus, those were guys they got in the offseason. So they have some more shooting, I think. I feel like with those three seeds, Cleveland may be the one that might be the biggest one that's on quote unquote fraud watch. I'm not saying that they're,
Really? Oh,
I'm
okay.
not
So
saying,
of the three top seeds.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
like yeah, like
I
I'm
would
not
agree with
saying,
that.
yeah, like I'm not saying that they are frauds, but I feel like that's the one where you just like I feel like of those 3, they would probably be the most likely one to be upset in the first round. Of course, it
Agreed.
depends on who they play.
Yeah.
But the thing is they're 3rd in defensive rating, so we know they're a very good defensive team. But they're, basically league average on offense. So, but again, that's with a decent amount of their guys missing a decent amount of time. So if they can get, Evan Mobley back, maybe he can kind of give them something. It's just that, again, there's somewhat of a concern because with Jared Allen being the lone big for most of the year next to a floor spacing big, that's kind of helped them. But then all of a sudden, if Mobley comes back, then you have a problem where it's like, all right, now you're back to 2 bigs, neither of which really space the floor. He's shooting 31% on threes, which, is not bad, but it's less than 1 attempt a game. So
Right.
he's not really shooting threes anyways. So he's clearly not comfortable taking them. So, that's something to kind of think about. So if the young guys, and I think Evan Mobley is probably the one where it's like, hey, if he can shoot a little bit better, right, that'll make it better. Garland, I think has had a little bit more of a down year. To be fair, some of it's because of the injuries, right? He had the jaw injury, right, that
Yeah.
kept him out for a long time. So if he can kind of get back into the swing of things, that'll help, right? Because I think Mitchell's played very well this year in the games he's been healthy.
Yeah.
Um,
He's the reason they're so
that's
high in the standings, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the main thing. I think you're hoping that the young guy, even a guy like Levert has had times where he's played well. He hasn't shot the 3 ball well. And again, like because guys have been out, that means more, of more pressure offensively for some of the other guys. So if they have their full rotation, right, they have a better shot. But you just don't know because, like, I don't like it's still kind of bizarre that they're a top 3 seed, but you do have to give them a lot of credit. And a big part of that is the defense and the improved play of Allen. It's just is this group going to work together in the playoffs? And I'm not sure. I don't really know because again, like there's a world where they improve off of last year, and then there's another world where they go out in the first round again.
Yeah, that's the problem. They're a very polarizing team, I think, and it's due to the fact that they have all these young guys and all these young talents who don't really have a whole lot of playoff experience. You have Donovan Mitchell, who's had a lot of it and a lot of exits, honestly. So that's also a factor that I'm looking at. But looking at this team defensively, like you feel really really good about them. Like you said, they're top 3 team defensively rated or whatever. But offensively, like you said, they're around like what 17. So that's pretty mid if you ask me. And I think, the X factor for me is it's tough to really talk about this, but I'm going to go with Darius Garland just because I think, he's my guy. So I'm going to be really hard on him. I think he needs to be aggressive. If he's aggressive and takes, a higher volume of shots, I think, you might see a little bit more success because, you do have 2 bigs down there. Like you said, it just depends on if Mobley's going to be back in time and things like that. But, Jared Allen's a very good rebounder and things like that. So, and I'm not saying he should jack, but I think he needs to be smarter because, he's also averaging around 3 turnovers a game. That's not very good in my opinion. And then also the field goal percentage is down, but I just want to see him take smarter, better shots and be less sporadic and just be smarter. And that could potentially, I think, put them over the edge because, him alongside Donovan Mitchell, I think is also another polarizing duo. you know, because a lot of people don't have belief in the double, you know, small guard lineup, you know, because both of them aren't amazing on defense. So that kind of kills that. But they are quick. So you know they can cut people off. But for Darius Garland on offense, I really just want to see him improve and just really take more shots.
Yeah, exactly. And that's going to be the interesting dynamic. You know, where it's like, you know, if they play, you know, in the first round, you know, because again, like just like the Western Conference, right? Like the Eastern seeding is up for grabs, right? Like right
Mm,
now, Indiana, I believe, is the 6th seed. So they would play Indiana in the first round. But, you know, again, the Pacers, the Sixers, and the Heat all have the same amount of losses.
yeah,
So if any one of those teams, you know, kind of wins their last few games, right, it could be one of those other teams. So I mean, it really just kind of depends, right? Because you know, you're not quite as scared of say like the Heat's guards, right? You know, on the perimeter as opposed to like you know maybe you know Tyrese Maxey for Philly or like Tyrese Halliburton for Indiana.
yeah,
Um,
Jalen
so
Brunson.
right, Jalen Brunson for the Knicks, but you know, so it just kind of depends. But yeah, that's the thing is the young guys, if they learn from last year and they improve, right, then that's going to help raise their ceiling where they could be, you know, like the team that you know gives you know one of those top seeds a scare, you
Yeah,
know. But if it's kind of a similar thing from last year, right, then it's going to be an upset. And if there's an upset, right, then you know, of course, then you have the questions of like you said, does that backcourt work? Will Mitchell stay there long term? But you know, for now, you just kind of tip your hat to the fact that even with all that's been going for them, you know, negatively, they've still been able to win a lot of games. So I
yeah,
mean,
rooting for
you know,
them wholeheartedly.
yeah. Then next up, you got the New York Knicks, right? Obviously, you know, that's a team, you know, that's made some significant changes, right, since last year, right? Obviously, guys like Quickly and RJ Barrett are gone. And in, you know, OG Anunoby, Boyan Bogdanovic, Alec Burks. I mean, the main X factor right now pretty much is Randall because obviously right now he's out. He's had that dislocated shoulder injury for a while. We still don't really know when he's going to come back, right? Anunoby just recently came back from his elbow surgery, I think he had. So that's good to see because when he's out there and he plays, they're a very positive, you know, they're very positive in terms of plus minus rating. So that's the main thing, right? Because if Randall doesn't come back, you're probably not going to be able to make a deep run because even with his, you know, playoff woes at times, he's still one of your best players. And he just adds another guy that can kind of create some of his own offense. Whereas, you know, outside of Brunson, you're kind of limited in terms of, you know, what you have there. They've been great, you know, on the defensive end, you know, since Anunoby's been playing, right? Right now they're 8th defensively. I think they were top 5, you know, before he went out, right? Because they had that stretch initially where they were winning every game,
Yeah,
basically. And then the injuries happened, and then that was kind of that. But their offense has dipped to 14. And, you know, I would think if Randall comes back, you know, they would be better than a, you know, 14th offensively.
hmm
Um, you know, it just kind of depends on what version of him you get. Because if he's kind of, because, you know, even last year he wasn't great in the postseason, but then we had the thing where we found out he had to have surgery. So he was clearly playing through an injury that was bothering him. So if he comes back and he still has, you know, a shoulder problem, right? If that's still bothering him, right, then that's going to be an issue because that's one of your best players and you need him to play well. You know, obviously they could still probably win a first round matchup, but they probably couldn't win, you know, two, you know, or let alone make the finals without Randall. So, you know, that's kind of the key thing for them right now. You know, and then obviously if he does come back, right, you know, can you still have that depth? You know, because they do have a lot of playable guys. You know, it's just obviously the depth is a little bit tested when Randall's out, right? They've been starting, you know, other guys in his place. You know, Mitchell Robinson, does he have a chance to come back at all, right? Because I know they couldn't get disabled player exception because they couldn't officially rule him out for the season. They've been able to do fine without him because Hardenstein's been great. And then Achua's been the backup, you know, and then occasional starter when other guys were out. He's been
hmm
really good for them as well. But I think right now it's pretty much Randall, right? Because which is kind of you know it feels like a cop out because it's kind of an injury related one, which you could say for any team. But because he is out, you know that's kind of the key. If he comes back, they'll be a lot better. And if he doesn't play, they probably won't be able to go quite as far, but they may not be as compromised in the first round.
yeah. And it seems like, you know, chemistry is also a factor as well. I think, you know,
Right.
their X factor would be chemistry and Julius Randle. It's a matter of can they get back on page because when they did initially, you know, when I think it was what it was during it was
Right
after
at
the
the end of last,
yeah because
right at the end
it
of
was the after the All Star or was it after or before the All Star break? I can't remember, but they were on a tear
the
and
yeah, the first tear came right after they traded for Anunoby. That was right at the end of
yeah.
December.
Okay, yeah. So, Yeah, like they went on multiple tears this season, so if they can get back on that kind of roadmap, I think there is a pathway for them to go out, or make it out of the first round because it would be intriguing. This is a very intriguing team. They've got a lot of dogs on here. You've got a lot of fighters. I think guys like Josh Hart. Their entire bench is pretty much their X factor as well because they play like starters, which is amazing to me.
Yeah.
You got guys like Josh Hart. You got Dante DiVincenzo. Obviously, Brunson is playing out of his mind, so that always helps as well. And then OG Anunoby coming back, but like you said, Julius Randle is the real X factor here. I think outside of their team chemistry, because you're losing a guy who puts up 24 points per game. Like no matter how you want to spin it, like that's 24 points that you're pretty much missing out on. But to be fair, there are guys on the roster who have kind of filled in the shoes, and it's been multiple people. So I don't think they're too worried, and I don't think they're going to want to rush him back into a situation like you were talking about where he's playing injured or something like that. So, but regardless, I think you do have to really look at Julius Randle and his impact and what it really means to this team. And I think it's a lot because I know we were hating on it early in the season because it was historically bad, but he has turned it around. It's just unfortunate that he's been hurt for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, I think they can still win a lot of regular season games without him, and I think they could probably win their first round matchup depending on who it is. They'd have a chance to do it without him. I just don't think they can make as deep of a run if he doesn't play. Only just because he does do some stuff that some other guys on the roster don't necessarily do.
Sure.
Like attacking downhill, he can create some offense.
Sure.
On his own. But again, and to be fair, now that Brunson has kind of established himself as the number one, you don't need as good of games from Randall anymore. Like where like say when he was first there and it was just him,
Right.
right? It was a problem because you didn't have anyone else to turn to. At least now you do have a Brunson or even like an Anunoby. They have some other shooters as well, right? Like Anunoby's just a better fit. He's a better shooter, plays more within the team than Barrett does.
Yeah.
DiVincenzo, now he's a starter, right? He fits really well. Just a better player, I think, than Quentin Grimes. So, again, they have a lot of pieces, and that's why I think the depth is pretty cool. And that's kind of like why now that Anunoby's back, they'll still probably be able to win enough games because now they're going to be able to defend much better, and they'll still be able to score just enough, where it's like in an ugly game, they'll be able to pull it out.
Absolutely.
Then you move on to the Orlando Magic, which has kind of been a roller coaster season for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were a team that had taken, I think, a much bigger leap than I think most expected.
Sure.
At the earlier in the year, they were like one of the top seeds in the Eastern Conference, right? Where they were like top three. Then the injuries kind of came, and they dropped, and were kind of 500 for a while. Now guys have started to come back, so they've rebounded. You look at their team, right? Fourth defensively, right? So they're an elite defensive team, but offensively, they're bottom 10, right? 24th, which is just not great. Obviously, it's a very young team, right? Your two best players are 21 and 22. Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner, respectively. They both played very well. Wagner, his three-point shot has been pretty bad this year. He's been basically at or below 30%, which is a lot lower than his previous seasons, right? Where he was like around 35, 36%. And that's, that's one of the X factors there, right? Obviously, because if he can get back to his previous shooting, that's going to help out a lot. The fact that Paolo's become a better shooter does help. Right? He's shooting 36% on threes, 4 attempts a game, which is really good. But you do need both of them, right? Jalen Suggs has been great. After kind of, a weird first couple of seasons, he's been able to turn it around from an offensive standpoint, especially, right? That was kind of the missing link where now he's shooting 40% from three. Wendell Carter Jr. shoots 40% from three. So they do have some good 3-point shooters. But then they have some other guys that aren't so great, right? Like Markelle Fultz doesn't really give you anything from three. Cole Anthony hasn't shot well from three this year. And then obviously Franz Wagner, as I mentioned. Jonathan Isaac, right? That's another guy where he's shooting 36% from three on the year, and he's been great, especially from a defensive standpoint. That was kind of a guy that we talked about going into the season where if he can play and give them something, that kind of raises, what they can really do as a team.
Yeah.
Especially, again, like they're not a top 5 defense probably. Without him, obviously they're still going to be really good, but now you have a lot of other options, even when your better players are off the floor. So it's a young team. So really it comes down to those two guys, Paolo and Franz. If they kind of elevate in the playoff series, right, where all of a sudden, like they kind of have the coming out party that we sometimes see with young guys in the playoffs, that's where they may actually have a chance to kind of pull off an upset. Like right now they're the 5 seed, so they would play the Knicks in the first round. I don't think they would be favored. Just
No, no,
because
no,
I
no.
think most yeah, because I think, it's a young team and most people would say Brunson's the best player on the floor. But they would have some guys defensively to throw at him because it's a giant team.
Yeah.
And it's not like a bunch of slow guys, it's a lot of really good athletes. So the main thing for them is the offense, right? Because again, not great in terms of shooting, just not great offensively. And that's going to be a problem come playoff time. Because you're going to have to at least at certain points be able to score. But the defense should, I think, be able to translate because again, they can switch, they can do a lot of stuff. But again, it's like if the shooting can't come around, it's probably going to be a lot more difficult. Just because you're not going to be able to match the other team offensively, primarily with twos. Because I mean, you don't have to be an amazing 3-point shooting team. It's just I think you got to at least be a little bit better. Like I said, and again, especially just from an offensive standpoint, it's hard if you're a bottom 5 offensive team to be
Yeah.
able to win a lot of playoff games. So that's kind of the main thing there. Obviously, they don't have really a lot of pressure because people don't really expect them to win a playoff series. So if they do, right, that's a bonus. If they don't, it's not the end of the world because it's a very young team. So they may be able to catch somebody by surprise. Obviously, we don't know ultimately where they're going to finish. But right now, 4 or 5 is within, they're currently 5. 4 is within reach because they're only, one loss behind the Knicks.
Hmm.
Um, Although the Magic, I think, have, a tough schedule. So it kind of really depends. If they kind of slide and fall down to 6, 7, it may be tougher. But if they finish
Both
as like
teams are
4 or
winning
5,
too.
yeah, exactly. But if they finish 4 or 5, that'll be fine. But I think it's really just the offense, mainly the shooting.
Yeah, if they can avoid the play-in, I think they have a legitimate shot at getting out of the first round as well. But this team, I think they're an intriguing one. They have a lot of upside, but they definitely have a lot of negatives. I think the negatives you spoke to, about the offense, they're very prevalent. If you've watched Orlando Magic basketball, you can kind of feel it and get a sense that they're just a young team, and that's kind of just growing pains that come with it. But I'm kind of looking at you know the two stars, like you were talking about, Paolo and Franz. This is something that we talked about when they first, came onto the scene back at the beginning of the season, where everybody was really surprised about how far can this team really go, and their crazy start. And we were talking about, I think it was we wanted one of Paolo or Franz to either they got to be in the 25 point per game category. Neither of them have hit that yet. Paolo is pretty close. He's averaging 22 points and very good shooting now, so that's really good. But I think if Franz can step up his game come playoff time, it's going to be a mismatch nightmare because you're going to have to deal with shooters because he's probably going to get a lot of open shots. If I'm going to guess, considering that his shooting has been a little bit down. So if he can knock those down and get the freebies, I think, that could be a potential game changer for them as well. And then, like you were saying, the depth, I think, is another piece that's interesting. And it's not just, depth where, it's just kind of willy nilly or you have veterans. It's all pretty much young guys that have something to prove,
Yeah.
like a Jonathan Isaac. Like you were talking about him. Like people were talking about him as a bust, a couple of years ago. And now he's kind of reemerged onto the scene with his defensive prowess and he's hitting his shots. That's the key. Guys like Cole Anthony, they're still prevalent. Even like a guy like Joe Ingles, like I know he's a little bit older. He's 30. Yeah, he's 36. So that tells you all you need to know. But he's a veteran presence there. And then even young guys like Jalen Suggs, I think he's also a slept-on X factor as well because he's been doing a lot for them. That doesn't really show up in the stat sheets. He's been playing out of his mind on defense, and then also the three-point shooting is really, really good. He's shooting, I think, around 40%. So they have a lot of positives. It's just a matter of can they be consistent and can they figure out some of the efficiency? Because I think consistency and efficiency are probably the two things that are holding this team back, and maybe their youth. Like their youth is a double-edged sword where it's an advantage and it's a disadvantage because you feel really good because they can chase anybody down and chase anybody off the floor defensively, but it's just offensively they might get a little bit too sporadic for some teams.
Yeah. And then, you move on to the Indiana Pacers. I think this one is really, when you kind of look at it, I think it's really Tyrese Halliburton because I think
Mm-hmm.
he's not really been the same guy since he had came back from the injury.
Yeah.
Because if you look at his splits, from earlier in the season,
Mm-hmm.
right? He was basically playing like a top 5, top 10 guy, right? Like if you look at, what he was doing in October, and November, right? In October, he averaged 20 and 12. Then in November, he was averaging 29 and 12 assists.
Yeah.
Um, and you look at the shooting, it was 53, 47, 87. And then in December, he averaged 21 and 14. But pretty much since January, he's basically been like a 15, and 10 guy, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of a far cry from what it was earlier in the season where his scoring was way up, to go with the passing. Because again, like that's kind of the main thing that I think if he's not quite where he was earlier in the year, that's probably going to be the main thing that holds them back.
Absolutely.
Because, again, it's kind of like what we talked about with Paulo and Franz, right? Like if you have one of those guys, in a playoff series, that's where you have your best chance to win. It's a lot harder to win when like, everybody on your roster is kind of down here a little bit more. And obviously again, the seeding has continued to change and shift around, right? Because earlier in the season they were doing, a little bit better, right? Now they're six, they're still 8 games above 500, which is good. And they're, I guess their defense has gotten better, since the Siakam trade.
Yeah.
But the offense has been a little bit worse. Just because I think Halliburton's effectiveness has dipped. Siakam's actually played very well for Indiana. Particularly like even from a 3-point shooting standpoint, right? Because when we were talking about him, one of our concerns was, it seemed like he had kind of drifted into being a bad 3-point shooter, the last couple of seasons. And then you look at what he's done, this season for Toronto, he's shooting like 37% from three.
Hmm.
The attempts are a little bit down, but still the fact that the percentage is up, you trust him a lot more, which is good, right? Obviously they did lose Benedict Mathurin, so that's a guy that you don't have coming off the
Yeah.
bench in the second unit. They they moved on from Buddy Hield, right? So it's Nemhard and Andrew Neesmith who are in the starting five.
Right.
So those guys are obviously important too, right? Because Neesmith is kind of their 3-and-D wing, and then Nemhart's kind of their other, playmaking but more defensive minded guard. So I mean, they do have a lot of guys. They'll still be able to score. It's just they need Halliburton, I think, to be, you know, more like what he was earlier in the season. And if he's not, that's probably where they're going to go out,
Yeah.
in the first round. But if he can get closer to what he was earlier, they may have a chance at pulling off the upset.
Yeah, agreed. Like I'm just looking at the numbers that you mentioned. The pre All Star numbers were very, very, very good. The post All
Mhm.
Star numbers not so great. Although it's only been 12 games played. That's the issue that's at hand. But offensively, the number two in the NBA right now. Defensively, though,
Yeah,
goodness,
it's
it's
still
like
not
it's like bottom six. So that
great.
that tells you all you need to know. I think they're a lost cause on defense at the moment.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing we can really say or point out to help them improve or anything like that. But like you said, offensively, it's kind of plain and simple. Your best player has to be your best player, and that's all he really needs to do. And I know he's like you said, he's coming off the injury, so that might be a tough task for him. But I think he can do it, because he's a great player. He's a phenomenal distributor, phenomenal facilitator, and has the scoring potential. That's what I love about him. So, it's all there. It's just a matter of can it all come together and gel together. But this could also be Siakam's chance to kind of, show why he was worth what they gave up and things like that. So, hey, it's intriguing, but I think they're also one of those weird teams where they could be a dark horse and like just out of nowhere come out with an offensive spurt and upset a team. If it comes down to it, but they could also flame out very early due to their lack of defense.
And then moving on to the Miami Heat, just get healthy. I mean,
True.
obviously that's kind of been a big issue for them. They are 36 and 30. I think they're 37 and 30 now, right? Because Bam hit the game winner three,
Yeah.
of all the guys hit,
Hmm.
a game winning three was Bam against the Pistons. Jimmy Butler didn't play, which again, kind of has been indicative of how their season has gone, where they've had some stretches, right? They first came out of the All-Star break playing pretty well.
Yeah.
Um, and then, recently it's kind of dipped, right? And again, it hurts that a lot of their guys have just not been available, right? Um, the guy that's played the most games is Bam Adebayo, right? He's played well, no, it's Jaquez and Duncan Robinson.
Okay.
But in terms of like their main core guys,
Right.
it's Bam, right? He played 56 games,
Okay.
57, I guess, out of uh 67, which is good.
Hmm.
But then you look around, right? Jimmy Butler, 47 games. So he's missed basically, 20 games, right? Tyler Hero, 36 games. So he's missed basically 30 games.
Yeah.
Obviously Rozier just came here recently. So, and he missed some time for them as well. So, I thought, the Rozier trade was good, right? Because it gives you another offensive minded guard.
Mm-hmm.
that can create, and it's just an upgrade at the point guard spot from Kyle Lowry, right? Who at this point in his career, is just not a starting caliber point guard, I think, for a really good team. Um, so, again, Hero, that's kind of one of the guys, right, that you kind of look at because he was in the trade rumors. He started the season off really well. But then he's been hurt, right? And he's kind of reverted back since that point to kind of his normal numbers, right? He's averaging a little over 20 a game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 40 from three, but 44 from the field, which is kind of the norm from him. At one point earlier in the season, he was averaging 25 a game. And
Yeah.
again, with Rozier in there, you don't really expect, his numbers to go up. You just kind of hope, I think, that the efficiency goes up
Yeah.
because of the fact that now you have another guard that teams actually do have to try to guard and stay in front of. Even though Rozier is a small guard, he is tough. But that's the main thing. We just haven't seen a whole lot of them healthy. They did lose Josh Richardson for the season. They brought in DeLon Wright, who's not really played. Pretty much, they're starting Jovic. I'm curious to see if that's what they do in the playoffs or if they
Right.
kind of go back to, Caleb Martin, or do they just let him come off the bench? Right. Jaquez, right? That's another guy, obviously, because, he's a rookie and he's been very productive for them. His three has fallen off. Right now, he's down to like 32% from three. But they have a lot of depth. I do think this is a solid team. I think it's, better, sneakily better than their record. Obviously, last year they were basically a play-in team. They were the 8th seed, made that finals run. I think it's going to be a lot tougher this year. They're going to have to, I think, have more things go their way. I feel like you could say that this team is probably still better than last year's team,
Yeah.
just because I think you have a little bit more talent. It's just guys haven't been healthy. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case, right? Like Hero, he had to have injections in his foot. So he's still going to be out for at least, possibly a couple of weeks. And once you get to that point, you're starting to talk about he may not be back until the end of the regular season, if that. They still have enough guys where they may be okay for against some teams, because they made the finals last year without him.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they still need to be fully healthy if they want to really get to where they go. And we just don't really have any indication that that's going to be the case. Even though some guys on their team have played really well, like Duncan Robinson's played well. Jaquez has played great for a rookie. Martin has still been productive.
Yeah.
Richardson, before he went down, he was really good for them. Um, even Love, right at this point, he's been hurt as of late, so he just hasn't played. But I think he's been productive. So they have a lot of guys that they can play. It's just they haven't been able to have all of them at once. If they can, I think they may be one of those teams where, like, if you're the higher seed, you don't want to face them. Like if they somehow got to like 6 and they were playing the Cavs in the first round, I think the Cavs would be a little bit worried about that matchup. You
Yeah.
know, even if they played Milwaukee or Boston, they wouldn't be favored. They probably wouldn't win, but they would probably at the very least give it everything they've got, and
Yeah.
if they're healthy, make it much more competitive, and make it a much longer series than I think it would normally be.
Yeah.
So they're one of those dark horse teams, I think, which they kind of were last year. It's just again, they need their guys.
Yeah, they're like a Trojan horse. That's kind of the way that I would describe, Miami, where, like you said, their
Right.
record is deceptive. Even
Nice
their
defense, offense.
yeah, exactly. Like even their advanced stats are kind of deceptive as well because they're very inconsistent. But their
Yeah.
inconsistency is kind of something that works in their favor, if that makes sense. When their backs are up against the wall, they normally do come around and kind of just come out on top. But, we've seen it kind of backfire and they lose games that are pretty much must wins and guaranteed wins. But regardless, I think their biggest X factor is really Tyler Hero. This is a guy, he averages 20 points per game. Pretty much he's been doing that for the past 3 years. He's only played in 36 games, like you're saying, but I think he adds so much value to this team. And also, I think he could take them pretty far if he's playing his best basketball, that is offensively. He doesn't really provide too much defensively, but system-wise, I think they really do need him because I would be really intrigued to actually see them make a playoff run where he is really, really involved because I think, last year he was pretty much hurt the entire time.
He didn't
So,
play at all.
exactly.
He
So
got hurt in the first game.
Exactly. So we didn't even get to see, Miami at their, I guess, quote unquote, full potential. So, this should be their year, but nobody really knows what's going on with him. I think they're going to reevaluate him in a couple of weeks or something like that, 2 to 4 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks or whatever. But regardless, I think he needs to come back and, show that he's one of those guys because, there's been a lot of talks about him being in every trade that's been, relevant to Miami and things like that. But their bench, I think, is also another thing that needs to be on watch because I think there are some guys that are pretty talented. Like you said, Caleb Martin, I think they need to make some adjustments. Who knows what they do in terms of starting lineups, but I don't really think that you can doubt this team because they do have Spo. I think he's also another one of their X factors. Where coaching, I think he's going to win a lot of coaching battles. So, say he comes up against more of an inexperienced coach, I think you can probably feel a little bit better about Miami, maybe due to their talent and things like that and coaching. So, I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, more of like a Trojan horse team, dark horse team where, they're liable to pretty much upset anybody.
Right, and their offense is really the main thing. Again, that's killing them. Again, ninth
Yeah,
in defense, which is great. But 21st in offense. Because if you watch them, in the first halves versus the second halves,
it's
it's
bad.
kind of Jekyll and Hyde. Because in the first halves, right, they're usually pretty good,
Hmm.
and they're at their best. But then in the second halves, they just kind of completely fall apart. And they don't look as good, right? And that's kind of contributed to, their losing streak as of late. And, because if they, played in the second halves like they did in the first halves, right, they'd probably still be, in like that around that 5, 6 spot.
Oh,
Because
for
I don't
sure.
think you would really want to be in the play in. Obviously, they're not going to care because they've been in the play in before.
Yeah,
It's just, again, it just makes it tougher. But
for sure.
again, it's harder when you don't have all your guys. Because again, like, like a game like Detroit, they could have easily lost this game. Jimmy Butler was out, and Hero was out, and Bam kind of bailed him out with a game-winning three,
Yeah.
which you wouldn't have expected.
And they previously lost to the
Literally,
Wizards. Like, come on now.
yeah, and like you said, they had lost, a few games before that, right? Like you mentioned, the Wizards. So that's the tough part, right? But again, it is a veteran team, and I think they're, one of those dark horses where you can't completely count them out, until they're gone.
For sure.
Next up, the Philadelphia 76ers, right? So they're the 7 seed. They're 37 and 30. Honestly, they've been kind of forgettable as of late.
Hmm.
I mean, you look at them, they've been, they've, kind of tried to survive without Embiid, and that's tough. And that's really the X factor, at least as of right now, is really his health. Because if he comes back and he's close to what he was before he got hurt, right, then they are a contender. And then if you're one of the top seeds and you have to play them, you're horrified.
Yeah.
But if he comes back and he's just, compromised and just not what he was before the injury, then they're gonna go home early.
Yeah.
So that's kind of really the main thing there. Obviously, you can point to other factors, right, as like a Tyrese Maxey, Buddy Hield, Tobias Harris, D'Anthony Melton, right? They have a lot of other guys, um, on this team that if Embiid comes back and is healthy, now they slot back into roles that are better suited for them. Now they have Nick Nurse, right, who I think, coaching wise is an improvement over Doc. But none of this matters if Embiid, isn't healthy, right? If he doesn't come back and he's not close to 100%, then there's nothing they can really do about it. Because, again, if your best player isn't able to really do much, then you have no chance, right? So I think that's kind of the main thing that you hope for if you're Philly is can Embiid come back and at least be close to what he was, and then maybe you pull off the upset. Obviously, you got to do everything on the road, which is a lot more difficult,
Hmm.
especially for the role players, right? Because role players tend to play better at home than on the road, right? Because before they were a top 3 seed, and now they're a play-in team. So,
Yeah.
and that's the other part, right? Because if you're still in the play-in, um, by the time the playoffs start, you're in a one-game scenario. If you just have an off game, right, then all of a sudden, you have
Bless
one
you.
more chance before you thank you, one more chance before you're eliminated. Obviously, if you're in 7-8, you get 2 chances,
Yeah.
right? They're not gonna drop to 9-10, right? They're pretty much safe there. It's just ideally you wanna at least do okay enough to be, out of the play-in. And in terms of their remaining schedule, right? We still don't know ideally when Embiid comes back, but their schedule, is kind of a mix of some tougher games, right? I think they play the Heat next, then they play Phoenix, then they play both LA teams. I think they play the Clippers twice. They play the Kings, they play the Cavs, they play OKC. So I mean, they play Orlando. So they play a lot of really tough teams, and we still don't know when Embiid's coming back. I think Ramona Shelburne kind of hinted that it may be like the last week of the regular season. So if that's the case, that means most of their tough matchups are still going to be without him. And
Yeah.
there's other guys that are out as well, like D'Anthony Melton, Robert Covington. Um, those guys have barely played as of late, right? Maxey was out with a concussion. I think Harris had an ankle injury recently. So
Hmm.
that's really the main thing is health, particularly for Embiid. If he's healthy and he, can give it a go and he's close to what he was, that's where they have the shot.
Yeah, it's really wild because Embiid is pretty much the only X factor here, like you were saying. You know, it's just all about his reevaluation. But he's such a huge X factor. I feel like just not just not for the playoffs, but even the playoff race. Because what if he comes back earlier? But the problem is, like, even if he does return before the playoffs, like, what type of condition is he really going to be in? Is he going to be in a good condition where he's playing at that MVP level? Or is it going to be one where it's going to take him some time to ramp up? And then how long will that take? So, and like looking at the history, he's never really been one to like make a fast, quick recovery. So I think it's kind of hard to assume that he can come back from a knee surgery and like pick it up right where he left off.
7 foot, 300 pound guy. That's usually just kind of tough.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting how much this impacts like a lot of seeds. So it should be interesting. It just really all comes down to when he returns and if they potentially go on a run, or it could make the difference between a playoff matchup being solidified L or potential W or L. Because like the thing is, I feel
Right.
like before he got hurt, 76ers were pretty much the only threat in the East that everybody thought could take out Boston because of Embiid's MVP, caliber play. But, without Embiid, they're pretty much irrelevant. And that's no
Yeah.
disrespect to the 76ers.
Right.
It's just the truth. That's
Any
just what
team that
happens.
any team that loses their best player is immediately
Like, look at
compromised.
Denver without Jokic. It's the same
Yeah,
thing everywhere.
exactly. Right, because that's the thing. And again, the seeding is close. 6 through 8 all have the same amount of losses, basically.
Yeah.
Just not the same amount of wins. So if Philly, kind of sputters, because again, as I just read off, they have a difficult stretch coming up. So if they continue to blow some of these games and they're the 8 seed, right? They're in the play-in, they have to go on the road. And if they win their 7 and you play the Bucks, if you lose, you have to win the next game so you can be 8, and then you play Boston, and that's just not ideal. I
Yeah.
mean, and again, like if Embiid is close to what he was, you have a real chance to upset, one of those teams. But I think ideally you'd want to go up to 6, right? If you can. And they do have a shot at it. It just becomes so much more difficult, without your best player. Because then that means again, you have to work a lot harder, to try to win some of these games. Because again, like
True.
I already mentioned, those games aren't easy. And there's a big difference between 6, 7, and 8, right? Because again, like I said, beyond the play-in, it's just a much easier matchup. You would rather play the Cavs in the first round, and potentially like you could maybe able to survive Embiid not quite being 100%,
Hmm.
but if he's close to like, let's say if he's like 80, 85, he could still probably be good enough to be able to take you home.
Right.
But that wouldn't be enough against the Celtics or the Bucks, just because again those teams are just a lot better.
Yeah.
So if he
It's
can be,
tough, bro.
yeah, right, he's gotta be the best player on the floor, and
Hmm.
even regardless, right, again, in previous postseasons, right, he's kinda had stretches where he's kind of not been quite as impactful as he was
Yeah.
in the regular season. Again, we've talked about the difference between, his regular season and postseason numbers. I think some of that you hope with the different coaching staff, different schemes, and different personnel that might just be fixed. And he might just be better anyways, but it's gonna be tough because he may not even be able to show it just because he had the meniscus injury, which just stinks.
Yeah.
Because before that, I think they were one of the true contenders, right? They may have had, like you said, the next best shot after the Celtics, or at least the best shot at beating the Celtics, because they have a guy that's a real mismatch, in Embiid.
Yeah, like nobody was slowing him down. Nobody was stopping him. So that's kind of the hard part and the hard pill to swallow for the 76ers. But I mean, at least they're still in it. That's all I can really say about them.
Um, then you have the last two teams, right? The Bulls and the Hawks, right? I don't think necessarily factor in quite as much, but they
Yeah.
are in the play. And we did do the 9 and 10s for the West. The Bulls, right? Obviously, they have other guys out, right? No Patrick Williams,
Yeah.
no Zach Levine, but you do have other guys, right? Oh, no Lonzo Ball as well, right? But you do have Kobe White, who's played great, and that's probably one of their main X factors, right? Because he's pretty much for the last few months, right, has basically been on a tear, right? He's been starting this year, as opposed to coming off the bench, and he's basically had his best season, right? I think he could be, the guy that pulls off, the most improved player award.
Yeah.
He's basically averaging 20 a game, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, 45 from the field, 39 from three. He missed the last couple of games, I think, with a hip injury. Before that, he had played in every game. So I think he's kind of, crucial to their attack from the guard standpoint. Obviously, DeRozan does his thing, as a scorer, right? Especially late in games. So you know who to turn to. Vucevic, right? That's a guy where he's been putting up numbers, but his 3-point shooting has not been great.
Yeah.
28% on the season. Even though he is shooting 48% from the field. And the counting numbers look fine. But then, they end up usually oftentimes kind of going to Drummond to close out the games because of that defensive factor, right? There were games at one point where both of them were starting together, which was
Yeah,
wild.
that was mad
When they
cringe.
had guys, yeah, when they had guys out. But that's kind of the main thing. So they still have a decent amount of guys. Obviously, if they're the 8 seed, right, it's probably going to be rough, against the Celtics. They always play them tough, I think, because again, DeRozan's a guy that late in games, can be a problem for a lot of teams. But I would say probably Kobe White because again, if he can come back and be healthy and keep up that level of play, that can help Chicago kind of stay afloat because they've actually been pretty good. Since that early part of the season where they were like 10 games above 500, right? Because now they're basically only a couple games below 500.
Yeah.
I think they started off 5-14. So basically they've been, way above 500 since then, right? I mean, they've only lost like 20 games since then and they've won, almost 30. So,
Yeah.
they've been way above 500 since that ugly start and those guys have a big part to do with that.
Yeah, I think Bulls fans should be a little bit more optimistic than they were, at the beginning of the season, where, now you're missing two crucial players and you're still vying for the play-in, which I think, a lot of teams would kind of just give up and throw in the towel at that point. But, like you said, Kobe White is pretty much keeping them alive alongside DeMar DeRozan in his clutch, valiant efforts. But yeah, for sure, I think Kobe White is the X factor because, say he goes off and blows up. Hey, we could be looking at the Bulls as, I don't know, the 8th seed, like you were saying.
Yeah.
So,
And
that's
then,
how I feel about them because I feel like there's not much to really say about like Chicago or Atlanta just because of where they are and what is their impact going to be because even like if we look at like the West compared to it, like the Bulls and the Hawks are on a completely different level than some of the teams in the West that are in the play-in, and it's a worse level.
right. Yeah, exactly. And then, for the Hawks, right, Young's out, right? So that's kind of the main thing there, right? If he comes back, and he's healthy, it's going to be interesting, right? Because, the backcourt of DeJounte Murray and Trey Young just hasn't really worked,
Yeah.
right? Obviously for, when they were healthy, right? They were pretty much, a 500 below 500 team. Obviously now that, it's kind of been DeJounte Murray running the show, I guess they've been mediocre, right? They've had some games that they've won, they've had some games that they lost. It really hasn't been that much different. Obviously, they lost to Sadiq Bey, right? That's a tough loss because he was a guy that did help them at times. Um, the lineup's a lot different, right? Not Dejounte, DeAndre Hunter no longer starts, right? He
Yeah.
comes off the bench. I mean, he's been pretty fine off the bench. Jalen Johnson, right? He was out for a while. He's back. He's been a key guy for them as well. He's been great this year when he's been healthy. Um, but again, then you look around, right? Onyeka Okongwu, who was a big piece, he's been out. Don't know when he's coming back. So if they can get those guys back, maybe they might be able to get out of the play-in. But even then, again, if you're 9-10, your ceiling is 8. And if you're 8, you're playing the Celtics in the first round. And I just don't think you're going to be able to upset the Celtics, unless they just have a catastrophic injury, knock on wood, just because, again, of, the situation they're in.
Yeah, the Hawks, they're a tough one. Like honestly, they might not even have an X factor if you want me to be honest, but that's kind of hard to say considering that, almost every team does. So I guess it would be maybe DeJounte Murray because I feel like he's probably the most liable to explode. Obviously, if Trey Young comes back, it's going to be, a Trey Young performance because we do know that he does tend to elevate in the playoffs a lot, actually. So, I guess it would be Trey Young if he's healthy, but DeJounte Murray, if not, in his stats, it's kind of interesting. Like, there's been a intriguing narrative about him. People have been saying he's the reason why the Hawks are mid. I don't think he's the sole reason. I think it's just more so a collective team fit with revolving around him. Because I think his numbers are pretty decent. It's just the defense is taking a massive hit. That's the issue. But
Yeah.
regardless, I think he's still going to provide a lot to the Hawks if they do make a playoff push or something like that. Like it's not like they're not going to be relying on him. They need him if they want to win a series.
Right. Yeah. And again, like, the other young guys we mentioned, right? Jalen Johnson, Onyeka Okongwu.
Yeah.
Johnson's back, but Onyeka still isn't back. So,
Yeah.
if those other guys, can come out and it gives them more depth, right? That could probably help. But I just don't see a world where they, even if they get out of the play and get out of the first round, because
Right.
again, you're the 10 seed, so your ceiling is 8. And
Right.
again, that means you have to play the Celtics. And I just don't see a world where they can beat the Celtics. It kind of really just comes down to, I think, if they can get into the playoffs, who kind of shows up and plays well,
Right.
because that may kind of determine who they decide to keep around,
That's a good point.
next season.
It's like a test run.
Right, yeah, because that may determine who they might decide to keep around for next season. Because again, if some of those younger guys play really well, right? Like say if a Kungwu comes back and he plays really well, you might be like, okay, maybe we try to move on from Capella. Maybe we try to move on from, Bogdanovich, or
Sure.
somebody like that. Kind of like with the Bulls, right? If some of these other guys play well, obviously they'll probably try to look to move like a Zach Levine or somebody like that in the offseason. So that's kind of really what it is at this point, right? Because they're I think it's just kind of like a test run, like you said, to just kind of see, who's gonna play well and who can they really count on, and that might determine what they might do. Like some of these guys may not be here next year for the Hawks. Some
Yeah,
of them
sure.
will, but others may not, right? And there may be a big, and that may be a big part in it, where it's like, again, like, you play well and you might stick around, or you might be able to just up your trade value and, you might go
True.
somewhere else. And the
Yeah.
Hawks may be able to recoup something back for some of these other guys. It's just been a bad year for Atlanta, where, there was I think, a thought process that they would be better than last year. And we thought they'd be better than last year, but
Yeah.
they have not been. They've been worse.
Yeah.
So
We gave them a lot of room for error, and they still made a lot of errors.
yeah. Right, yeah, because that's the good news is that they're not gonna fall anywhere past 8.
Right.
It's just you don't wanna be 7, 8 because then you're in the play-in, and even if you get out of the play-in, you're playing one of those other 2 best teams in the first round, which is just not ideal, right?
Mhm.
So, that's the issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, that pretty much is it for, the X factors, in the East. And, because again, the East is a little bit different than the West, where the top of the East is still really good. But as you get closer to the bottom, that's where you have teams, that are a little bit weaker, right? Because again, like you mentioned, the play-in teams in the East are a lot different than the play-in teams in the West,
For
right? Like,
sure.
in the in the Eastern Conference, right? I mean, again, Philly obviously without Embiid really isn't a play-in team. With Embiid, they're not really a play-in team, and that's just because of injuries. But like Miami, and then Chicago and Atlanta. But then in the West, right, you have a team like Dallas,
Mhm.
right, or Phoenix, right, or LA or Golden State, right. Those
Mhm.
are all playing teams. I just feel like those teams are probably better. Other than Philly, who, like I said, I just don't think is a playing team. Only because
Yeah.
they're only a playing team because of the injuries. But
Agreed.
yeah, so that's kind of a wild thing, And again, we mentioned Dallas, right? That game winner was kind of wild.
Oh yeah, from
With
Kai.
the
Oh my gosh.
yeah, the Kyrie Irving sweeping hook against the Nuggets, right, where it
Mhm.
looked like the Nuggets were gonna pull out another game in crunch time. Um, but the Mavs, they were able to get the Luka 3 and then the Kyrie, game-winning layup. So that's and again, that's kind of the interesting thing about the playoffs is some of these lower seeded teams, if they can get a good matchup, they may have a chance. It's just, kind of comes down to who, is able to close, right? Like say, obviously the Lakers Warriors game, right, where
Hmm.
AD goes out, after the first quarter, right? Like that's a big deal because
Yeah.
a loss like that makes it more likely where like now the Lakers are 10, and you have to deal with, who knows what happens with AD. Maybe he comes back and he's fine the next game, or maybe he has to miss a game or two.
Yeah. You're right.
Because you need those guys for the final stretch,
Because he
right?
went out with an eye contusion and
Yeah,
his eye pretty much
yeah,
closed shut in the first quarter, which is wild.
right.
So it's
Yeah,
pretty
exactly.
serious.
So you only got 10 minutes of him,
Yeah.
in a game that was pretty back and forth, a game that was also ruined by the
Yeah. That
replay
that
review
was ridiculous.
system, right? Yeah, which is kind of another thing to talk about, before, because there's not really a whole lot of news and rumors, but yeah, that was kind of a wild thing where again, like that's probably going to be one of the most watched games of the year. Maybe they dropped a little bit because AD went out, but still people are going to be watching
Yeah.
because it's
People were
LeBron and
tuned.
Steph. Right, and, the last we sat basically like a half hour for the last, and only like 5 seconds of the game clock, went off, right? Because you had a bunch of reviews, right? Because they had the review where they looked at the LeBron 3 and then took it away.
Yeah.
We've seen that before, right? I think in the playoffs, what was it, a couple years ago, right? Max Strus had that 3 against the
Yeah.
Celtics, and then it was taken off, and
Yep.
that actually unlike the Laker Warrior game, that actually was a big difference because that was basically like a one possession game
Yes, sir.
where, if that three counts, Miami would have already actually had the lead because, it was basically down to the wire.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, like it's kind of an interesting thing where, like some stuff they can look at prior to and take that away. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's other stuff where they may not necessarily be able to, right? Like let's
Yeah.
say if a guy travels, right, they're not going to look back at the play and say, "Oh, he traveled, so we have to take it off." The other one they take away is like if somebody gets off a shot at the end of the shot clock after it goes off, they take that off.
Yep.
Because that happened in the Lakers Bucks game where there was a Bobby Portis shot that went in after the buzzer, the shot clock went off, and
Yes.
that ended up being like a 1 point game basically. So
Yep.
that kind of had a so that was a huge factor, right? And then we had the stretch, right, where it was like, um, then they right after they took the LeBron three away, then they looked at the challenge, right, where it was Draymond, and they were trying to see if he was out of bounds. But if you looked, he had traveled, but they couldn't look at the travel. They could only look at whether or not it was out of bounds. So
Yep.
if he was in bounds, right, then they would have gotten it back because they wouldn't have been able to look at the travel, right? Then they also had that other play where they couldn't determine, who touched the ball. So then they just did a jump ball. Then they had another one that nobody even I think really noticed, where I think the Warriors had a possession where the shot clock went from 9 and then it reset to 24. So
Yeah.
they actually got basically another full possession. And nobody noticed it. So, they're obviously not going to take that possession away, but it's just
Right.
kind of a weird thing. And then of course they had the shot clock malfunction.
Yeah, that was
Where we were
stupid.
basically yeah, and then they had to have the PA guy basically announce the shot clock, which is just kind of dumb,
Yeah, that
just
shouldn't happen.
right. And that's more so like I think the equipment in
Yep.
LA versus like just a, normal NBA thing, right? Because they had the thing with the statue, right, where they had the typos,
Yep.
on the statue or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, I'm glad that it happened like in a nationally televised game because I think it's something that's going to need to be adjusted because, obviously this is a regular season game, although it did have big implications. But, what if this was like game 7 of a playoff
Oh my
series, right?
God.
Where like we saw, right? Because we saw the Celtics and the Heat, right? They took the point away, or like, let's say, a guy travels, on a play, but then they get the ball back because they were still in bounds, and then they win the game in game 7, and then the series is over, and it shouldn't have
Yeah.
gotten to that point. So, the replay system, because it's not the officiating, it's just the replay system is kind of broken. And I know it was adjusted because it was a few years ago, right? They took away, the ability to just kind of automatically just look at everything in the last 2 minutes because then it got to a point where every out of bounds play they would look at,
Yeah.
to see who touched it
The
last. And it
games were
got kind of
dragging
hard.
on way too
Yeah,
long.
like yeah, there was that Clippers Suns game in the playoffs, right? The one I think where it was the DeAndre Ayton lob game winner, inbounds game winning lob. And the final part of that took forever because they
Yeah.
kept on trying to figure out who it was. So they made this change, but it's still not ideal in terms of where it wants to be.
Yeah, it should be fair,
So
man. It's not really fair right
right.
now.
Right. So that's kind of something that I think, beyond that specific game, that's just something that has to change because you don't want, again, a situation in the playoffs where stuff like that happens where, like, say in the playoff game, the shot clock resets when it shouldn't, and then a team gets an extra possession, in a
Yeah.
finals game or a regular playoff game. For a regular season game, it happens a lot. Like there's been many times in a regular season game where points get taken off the board or something is retroactively overturned because of whatever. Like we've seen that a lot. It happens
Hmm.
in a lot of games. It just probably shouldn't it shouldn't come to that moment because again, like the other stuff where it's like you can only kind of choose, or the ones with the challenge where it's like you challenge a foul and then you win the challenge, but then they're like, oh, somebody else fouled, so then you
Yeah.
won the challenge, but you really didn't
Yeah.
because it's still not the result you want,
Pointless stuff.
which technically is the correct call. But again, if you can only pick and choose, what you can and can't look at, that's a problem. It's really the consistency that we're really looking for, which needs to be fixed. It's not so much that you can't go back and look at stuff. It's just that, again, it's a lose lose situation because if you bring back the old stuff where you can look at anything, then, like you said, it's going to drag on for way too long. And the last 5 minutes of a game could literally be a freaking hour, which we've seen before. But then if you don't, then you're going to have a situation where there's going to just be the wrong call and somebody's going to be in a position where everybody can see that like you made a mistake.
Yeah. And like I said, I think it's just unfair. They need to come up with a system that's fair to both teams and, also fair to the replay people as well. Because, I mean, I don't know. It's tough. It's a debacle, but I'm sure they'll figure it out.
So it's going to be intriguing to see. I don't think anything's going to be done this season,
Yeah.
right? But obviously next season, and future seasons after that, that's going to be something to look
We
at.
better not see
I
any of
think.
this mess happen in the playoffs, though, because I'm gonna be pissed off, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can just see it, right? Where like something like that could potentially
Yeah.
decide the series, and we've seen that in the past, because like before they were able to do replay reviews, say like 20, 30 years ago, right? That happened a lot, right? Like where like say a team got a call that they shouldn't have gotten, or vice versa, or somebody missed something else, and they just couldn't look at it because they didn't have replay reviews, back then. But now that you have that, it should be getting better. It really shouldn't be getting worse.
Exactly. You would think, like, with the advancement of technology, hey, we should be in a different lane, but it's somehow gotten more convoluted and complicated.
Right. Yeah, and then, news rumors, not really much, although, congratulations to Isaiah Thomas. He got a 10-day contract
Yes,
to
sir.
come back to the Phoenix Suns. We were kind of, I think, skeptical and kind of pessimistic that he'd be able to get back onto a
Hmm.
team. I don't know if he'll really play a whole lot.
Right.
But at the very least, the fact that you get an opportunity to play, is something, and on a team that maybe they could, use some point guard depth. Again, not really going to help you defensively.
Not at all.
You know,
Which
yeah,
is kind of a
exactly.
wild move considering who Phoenix is right now. Like their identity
Right.
is like, oh yeah, we
Yeah,
don't we don't do defense here.
right.
You're
Yeah,
welcome here. Come on board, buddy. Like, oh my
right.
god,
Yeah,
that's hilarious.
right. Yeah, and
Shout out
now
to him
he is
though.
35. Yeah, and now he is 35, so he's older. But I think it's going to be really intriguing to see,
Yeah.
what he can do. If he gets any opportunities, because again, I don't know, because again, the Suns' rotation has been kind of set, for a while. In terms of the guys they've been playing, but just to be able to get an opportunity, I think is really cool.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, if you're out of the league, for a little bit, it's really hard to get back in, even on just a 10-day. So, hopefully he might have an opportunity to kind of show that he still has some game left and then stick around. Because I think he didn't play at all last season. He was out of the league last year,
Yeah.
and really didn't play much the year before that,
Hmm.
or the year before that, right? Because I think in the 21-22 season he played in 22 games, and then before that he only played in 3 games.
Right.
So really the last time that he was kind of consistently playing was when he was on the Wizards, right, in that COVID year.
Hmm.
Um, I think he played and I think he started, for the
Yes, he
Wizards
did.
that year for
Yes, he
most
did.
of the season, right? Yeah, so that's the thing is that you look at his games played, since he had that crazy year, back in 2017 where he averaged almost 30 a game,
Hmm.
it was fifth in MVP voting, right? Since then, when he was in Cleveland the following year, then LA, right? 32 games after that, then 12, then
Yep.
40, then 3, then 22. So, the hip injury really set him back, where he played through it in the playoffs. And then just never really seemed to recover since then, right? Because he kind of lost some of his speed. But hopefully he can come back and actually play, whether or not it's with Phoenix, regardless. Hopefully he just plays well enough that he can kind of stick around, for somewhere else and get, one more shot.
Yeah, I'm wishing him all the best though, because he had that emotional video where he's like, they counted me out, like they gave up on me, all this stuff. So it is really cool to see him back in the league. And yeah, I mean, like you said, he had a short tenure with the Wizards, wasn't the greatest.
Right.
And also, I did not like Celtics version of IT because he was, yeah, destroying my team pretty much every night. But regardless, hey, you can't hate on the success, and you love to see
Right.
him
And
back.
And he did have 2 short stints as a Laker, right? Because he was
True.
traded from Cleveland, I guess it kinda helped open up the cap space to get LeBron the following season, and they had played together, that year earlier before.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then he played again, that first year with Westbrook where they had that wild stretch where a bunch of people were out due to COVID.
Hmm.
So then they were just signing, teams were doing, like, the replacement players.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, he was one of them, and he
Hmm.
played a few games. I remember they had games where it was, like, him, Westbrook, Rondo, or like
Yeah.
him, Westbrook and like 2 or 3 other guards. It was like these crazy lineups and
Yeah. The three
rotations.
guard lineups. I remember those.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Scott
hopefully he
Brooks
can
used to
kind of
run those for the Wizards too. Trust me, I feel your pain.
yeah, so, hopefully he can stick around.
Hmm.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts, in the comments, about what you think about the X factors for these Eastern Conference teams, and what you think about maybe Isaiah Thomas coming back, into the NBA. And again, if you leave a comment, we regardless of whether or not it's on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, or
Yes,
X or whatever, we will
anywhere.
pick one and we will read it. At the beginning of the episode. If you've noticed, we haven't read any in a while, so that means nobody's commented in a
Yeah,
while. So
guys, comment. We need your feedback, please.
yeah, so again, continue to like, comment, and subscribe. We appreciate all the support, and we'll see you Friday.